All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about the politics behind the Olympics. Given that our competition today is, I believe, men's beach volleyball, I am very pleased to see everyone here. I know that there's a lot going on. So for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, Network 2020 is a New York City-based nonprofit that provides access to leading thinkers and doers in international affairs for both our audiences in New York and around the world. So we're really trying to create more nuanced conversations about global affairs. Today's talk is a little bit different than most. Instead of delving into the crisis in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, or anti-immigrant protests in the UK, we're really taking a look at the hopeful side of humanity. The Olympics is such a powerful idea. I think it's one that highlights common humanity and its roots as a competition that required a cessation of fighting, I think contains a glimmer of hope for all of us who would like to see a world that is peaceful. But there are politics behind the games too. And the Olympics and sports in general are a very powerful tool of soft power. And myself, having worked in public diplomacy for the US State Department, I have really seen firsthand how effective soft power can be. So we're very lucky today to have two wonderful experts here who know not just about soft power, but also about elite competition, the role of sports in society, and more. So it is my great pleasure to introduce first Dr. Susan Brownell. Dr. Brownell is a Curators Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the University of Missouri St. Louis. She is the author of Beijing Games, What the Olympics Means to China, among other books. From 2000 to 2008, she was a member of the Postgraduate Grant Selection Committee, an advisory council for the International Olympic Committee's International Olympic Studies Center, and she herself competed in US track and field Olympic trials before moving to China and becoming a national collegiate champion of China. So welcome, Dr. Brownell. I'm also very pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Hillyer. She is the founder and director of the Center for Sports, Peace, and Society at the University of Tennessee. She has worked on empowering women, girls, persons with disabilities, and refugees through sport, working with more than 5,000 men, women, and youth from over 100 countries. She herself was a D1 NCAA basketball player. So welcome to both of you. Their bios are a lot more extensive than what I have laid out here, but in the interest of time, I wanted to get to the conversation. So Dr. Brownell, starting with you. Sports, I think a lot like arts or music, are an important vehicle for soft power. So just to get all of us on the same page, how would you define soft power? And following that, for which countries is using sports as soft power most effective? And then kind of adding on one final question there, and are the Olympics more or less a vehicle for soft power than other kinds of sports competition? Like, does the grandeur and bigness of it all overshadow its soft power potential?
Well, the phrase soft power was invented by the scholar the Harvard scholar Joseph Nye, to refer to power that does not come from the barrel of a gun, military power or economic power. So it's really cultural power. It's the power of attraction. And he used as an example the US, which in some ways has been the model for a country that has a huge amount of soft power in the world. It really refers to a positive national image. And in terms of the cultural strength of the US, it comes from Hollywood movies, NBA players. So sports play a big role in the US's soft power. So that was Nye's formulation. Actually, though, the use of Olympic Games to promote a positive national image really predates that. So, and in some ways, it was Japan that started that trend with its hosting of the 1964 Olympic Games in Tokyo, which were intended to indicate Japan's sort of peaceful reincorporation into the international community after the catastrophe of World War II. And actually, Japan paired that with a World's Fair, so the Osaka 1970 World's Fair. So that was sort of a model that then got picked up in East Asia because of the rivalry between Japan, China, and Korea. So Korea next used that model with the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games, and then China felt like it really had to get on board and it couldn't be left behind. And so China's desire to host an Olympic Games in large part came out of that East Asian rivalry. And then it finally achieved its goal in, of course, 2008. But that was a summer Olympic Games. And then meanwhile, Japan had hosted 2 Winter Games, and Korea won the right to host the 2018 Winter Games. So then China was sort of like under pressure, like, oh no, we're getting left behind again. We better host a Winter Olympic Games. So, you know, then they were all even, except of course, Japan went ahead and hosted another Summer Games in 2021. So that regional rivalry has really played a big role in the fact that we had 3 consecutive Olympic Games hosted by East Asian countries for the first time. It was the first time ever there had been a series outside the conventional Western powers. So these days, countries that are using the Olympic Games, and there's also the FIFA World Cup, and there's also World's Fairs, you know, it's still kind of a big thing in East Asia, but there is also Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. So countries that they aren't major military powers, and they're looking for other ways to make their mark in the international community.
All right, great, thank you. Dr. Hillyer, in your work at the Center for Sport, Peace and Society, you lead a team that helps global leaders develop innovative solutions to social political challenges using sport. So why have you seen, how have you seen sports to be an effective means for this? And can those lessons be translated to a highly complex and visible podium, pun intended, like the Olympics?
Pun intended. Well, let me just add on to Susan, because first of all, you fully encapsulated like the East Asian rivalry and the history of soft power. I wanted to add some context to that because I think what you said is so important. Then there was 1972, you are the expert, but what we know is ping pong diplomacy between the US and China. And that was also like this first-ish recognition, I think, on the American side, very unintentionally, about the power of sport for this new thing called soft diplomacy. And then the US Department of State's response, or kind of brainstorm after 9/11, was how do we more creatively and more effectively engage disenfranchised youth around the world to prevent this new norm, unfortunately, of disengaged youth being radicalized for terrorist purposes. And so it was in response to 9/11 that our State Department formed what at the time was called Sports United Division, which now has been renamed the Sports Diplomacy Division. But it was essentially within the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs of, okay, how do we engage youth in a meaningful way? And sport was at the top of the list. Music was at the top of the list, art. So you think all these forms of pop culture, and engaging a strategy that was about people-to-people diplomacy, soft diplomacy, as Dr. Susan said, not down the barrel of a gun. And so going back to your question, really, the launch of the Center for Sport, Peace and Society was based on what was untermed at the time, sport as a tool for development and peace building and sports diplomacy. We started this initiative in '94, actually in China. And really all of that became evidence that beyond anecdotal evidence of the power of sports, that no matter what your language is, no matter what your culture is, no matter what your faith perspective is, socioeconomics, that it had this really unique power to bring people together in a way. So I think one of the most interesting things about sport as a tool for diplomacy and peace building that goes unspoken is what sport provides is an agreed upon set of rules. There are rules of engagement in sport defined by the sport. So football has rules, basketball has rules, tennis, and those are agreed upon. And I think oftentimes in conflict, and I mean war and conflict and displacement, the rules that should govern humanity are broken and dismantled and become confusing. And I think as a microcosm of like what we hope in this world, that rules and order define the way that we interact with each other as humans, somehow that remains intact, right? And there's penalties, and everybody agreed to those penalties if you're outside the rules of engagement. And so I think when people of differences come together within the confines of a sporting event, or that there's this mutual respect of the work that you've put in, the effort, your talent, your skills, what you bring to that court of play. But then there's this sense of safety that we have with one another, because there's an agreed set of upon rules that we can bring out the best in one another. And I think war is a space where we bring out the worst in one another in humanity. And sport is a way that, like, Courtney, you, and Susan, you, I need you to be your best athlete and your best self, because without you being your best, I don't know how to get to my best. And so competition, although we use war metaphors for competition, I actually think competition is about collaboration. I get to collaborate with you so that you can bring out the best in me. And when I'm my best, I get to bring out the best in you. So the Center for Sport, peace at the center of everything we do in society, is really based on the humanity, the linguistic barriers removed, the cultural, the faith, and there's safety and vulnerability in having the opportunity to bring out the best in one another.
It's a really, really beautiful way to capture that idea. Thank you. Dr. Susan, turning to you, you started touching on this idea of regional competition when it came to hosting and sort of that power of hosting. I'd like to just stay on that for a little bit. In part, I'd love for you to, I have a two-part question. If you could first just talk about if you've seen any trends in host country selection over time, because obviously, yes, Japan, Korea, China, but also, the rest of the world. Have you seen any trends in host country selection over time, and what the impact has been on hosts, particularly on ones that are emerging powers like China in 2008? And then how was China affected by hosting the Olympics, and how are other countries' perceptions of China impacted by it?
Yeah, so when Beijing hosted the games in 2008, we entered a really interesting period when the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, was pretty committed to giving emerging nations a chance to host Olympic Games, and taking the Olympics outside of Europe, and taking the Olympics to Africa even was kind of a goal. And so we had a whole string, actually, of Olympic Games outside of the conventional Western powers and going to emerging powers like Brazil, for example. Russia hosted the 2014 Sochi Games. Brazil hosted both the World Cup and an Olympic Games. And we had the 3 consecutive games in East Asia. And I guess from my perspective, that seemed like a very positive development, because my position on allowing emerging nations to host Olympic Games is that even if their system of government isn't the one that you want, I think sports and Olympic Games are a relatively harmless thing in the grand scheme of the world order. And if we can't even have an inclusive world order in the realm of sport and the Olympic Games, that really doesn't augur well for the future of a more inclusive world order. And those countries that are becoming more wealthy are a little they're frustrated. You know, there's a little bit of anger there. China will state it outright that they don't think the US wants China to develop and become a world power, and they're trying to keep us down, you know. So anyway, why not let them host Olympic Games, even if you don't like their political system, was sort of my position. However, it did look like there was a backlash against that, because then the rules for hosting were completely overhauled. It's no longer a public bid anymore. It's managed tightly in-house by the executive board of the International Olympic Committee. They choose hosts, potential hosts. They cultivate relationships with them is sort of how they describe it. And finally, you know, they arrive at one host that they recommend to the IOC session, and then, you know, they hope to get a positive vote on it. So, you know, somehow then the result of that system is the Olympic Games, starting with Paris and going forward, are all going back to conventional Western powers that have hosted them multiple times. So I do see trends. I see that there was inclusiveness. I saw that the IOC would not describe it this way, but you know, if you look at the pattern, it looks like a backlash against inclusiveness. It looks like the West reasserting its grip, you know, over at least the Olympic Games. So how was China impacted? If you look at national image surveys, it almost looks like the 2008 Olympic Games had a negative impact on China's national image. But that does differ between the developed world and the developing world, because I think for developing countries, China was a real model, and seeing that incredibly fantastic Olympic Games that they organized in 2008, which was probably the best organized Olympic Games ever. And a lot of people, myself included, would say it was the best opening ceremony ever. So anyway, seeing that, you know, was a real encouragement to India and to other countries in the developing world that thought, hey, you know, we can do it too. A non-Western countries capable of emerging and then standing on the world stage as an equal with powerful nations. So with national image surveys, then you do see a bifurcation between the developed world where it got worse and the image got worse. And that was probably because the US, Germany, countries like that suddenly saw China as much more of a threat than they had previously seen it. In that respect, maybe that's what China wanted, you know, the leadership. At least then China got more respect and was perceived, you know, as a powerful rival. So that is something that, you know, that whole traumatic process for China might have discouraged them from bidding again for the Winter Games. That bid was actually not really in the plan. It was a somewhat reluctant bid. But the IOC had formed, some members of the IOC had formed tight relationships with the people who had organized the Summer Games in 2008 and persuaded them to bid. They actually thought they wouldn't win because, first of all, you normally have to bid twice to win. But the other big thing was these already two consecutive games in East Asia, Tokyo, and the Pyeongchang Winter Games and then the Tokyo Summer Games. So it was two consecutive Winter Games in East Asia. And they thought that that wouldn't happen because the wisdom had been that the games should rotate around the world and that the IOC wouldn't send them back, you know, to a world region that had just had them. I think there was a little bit of a feeling that the West isn't all that happy about the rise of East Asia, so they probably won't, you know, let it happen again. So I think China was actually taken a little bit by surprise when it got those Winter Games in 2022. And then, of course, it's in the midst of a pandemic that China was blamed for. So, you know, that was yet another very traumatic experience for China. And when I was back in China in September, I was told that the State Sport General Administration, which is the Ministry of Sport, has decided not to bid for any more Olympic Games in the foreseeable future. I mean, I think they were really put through, you know, a tough process with both of those games, and they just don't really, and they recognize that it had both wins and losses for China's soft power. So I think, you know, they're going to put that on hold for a while and maybe focus on other things.
Right. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it was interesting too, having watched the Russia Olympics in 2014 as well. And I think that there was the criticism in the media of, you know, what was finished and what wasn't finished. You know, I think it does have, it can have that negative impact that's unintended as well. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, also like when I think about the games being in Beijing, I can't help but think that maybe more than ever that I can recollect were the conversations about human rights abuses and China's role in that. Yeah, I don't know that it had been talked about and highlighted to the degree that it was other than around the Beijing Games. And then as subsequent World Cups, Qatar's bit, you know, all of that, really human rights came on the scene, like directly correlated with, you know, these mega sporting events. And Susan, I can remember, I think I told you this previously, being in Beijing, actually near Tiananmen Square, when they announced that that Beijing got the 2008 Games, and what a source of national pride it was. I also remember in those years when they were working on the bid, driving around Beijing, and we were working at many of the sports institutes and universities, and with the women's fast pitch national team, and seeing these crews, these like street crews, like painting trees and green grass to make it look more like it was green and friendly and, you know, not such a concrete jungle. So it was interesting to see the ways that they portrayed what Beijing was to the IOC and those that were bidding and create. I mean, they put up fake palm trees everywhere just to beautify it. And the juxtaposition of beautifying the environment and then trying to hide the ugly of the human rights abuses, and how many people groups were displaced and unfairly and really more than displaced in order to create the venues for the game. Just the juxtaposition of that to me was really fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting how that, and I think that happened in Rio as well. And it really shines a spotlight on, you know, both what the country can do, and then also where the world sees a need for progress as well. So it can be a very double-edged sword. Dr. Sarah, continuing with you, you're a huge proponent of the ability of sports to promote peace. And at its heart, you know, I mentioned this in the introduction, the Olympics are a place where countries can come together regardless of international political dynamics. I mean, I think that that's really the idea. And one of the longstanding tradition is the Olympic Truce, which called for a cessation of conflict during and immediately after the games. Yet Russia has been banned from competing as a country in both 2022 and 2024 because of their invasion of Ukraine. And this is the third time that I think that they've been dinged for violating the Olympic truce. So in light of what seems to be a pattern for Russia, how can the Olympics remain effective at bringing countries together?
Yeah, I think sadly Russia continues to be the anomaly, but we need to see it as an anomaly, because I think the majority are honoring this truce and understand the value of what it does, and that it brings together our shared humanity. And so, you know, I can only hope that that the positive outweighs the negative. And I think that there's demonstration of that. And hopefully the pressure that's put on Russia or other nations that break the truce, that, you know, that they understand that as they're positioned in the world, and the world's perception of them actually matters through the lens of the Olympics. You know, every time I've watched the Olympic Games, and we'll watch the Paralympic Games, and you see the athletes of Russia and Belarus, and they're representing, you know, this this like shared entity. To me, that is the heartbreaking part, are these athletes that have served their nation through representation of their national teams. And sadly, it's the choices of the powers at be that affect, you know, the real humans in this life that, you know, are athletes and want to do something positive with it. And so this is not a very intellectual answer, but I think it stinks, right? But I think the majority is the Olympics does every 4 years remind the gaze of millions and millions of people who are watching, to remind us of the shared humanity amongst all of us. And I think more than any other sporting event, whether it's a mega sporting event or your local national sporting events, I love that during the Olympics and Paralympics that there is such focus on the human interest stories. Because yes, you have the most elite athletes in the world, you've got political challenges everywhere, but just for a second, you can pause, you can appreciate the athleticism, the commitment, the dedication, but then you get to know who these people are, the stories of the Ukrainian team and the focus on that and what they have been through and their commitment to stay in Kyiv or stay within the region and to be so proud to represent their country, I think provides hope for all of us. And, you know, in the Olympics, of course, it's an opportunity for the underdog, in this case, Ukraine, right, to demonstrate that that there's a part of humanity that cheers for the underdog, that we want everyone, despite the challenges you're facing or the environment or your infrastructure or all the things going against you, to rise above that and achieve success. And maybe that's a very Western-centered view, this sense of meritocracy. And but you know, overall, I think the Olympic truce holds tremendous value, and the large majority of the country or the world honors that for a cause that's bigger than our national interest and more for the sake of our global humanity.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one of the things, you know, having studied in Russia myself, that breaks my heart about this, and this goes back to the conversation about soft power, Dr. Susan, is, you know, one of my friends that I met in Russia, he chose to study Russian and in Russia, and he was a beautiful linguist because of the Olympics and watching the Russian gymnasts. And so, you know, that it has such a power of attraction, and it's sad to see that bit get lost. Dr. Susan, this is a little bit of a continuation of the last question, but broadening it out. The Olympics, I think, you know, when we look at it, it almost seems to reflect the world as we know it on a map. There's these neat borders, they're nation states, they're all coming together in one picture. However, the political realities, as we're talking about, are a lot messier. And today's geopolitical order is one that it seems even messier than before. It's been described by some of our past speakers as, you know, a fuzzy bifurcation of different blocs and alliances and conflicting economic and political dependencies. So how does the international sports world reflect these realities, whether it's in the inclusion of non-UN recognized nations like Kosovo, Chinese Taipei, or Palestine, or in this idea of competing games like BRICS, or I think it was Putin's friendship games? So what other observations do you have about this neat picture that's presented by the Olympics?
Well, let me just start with a little bit of a history lesson, which is that when the Soviet Union broke apart, so in the 1990s and early 2000s, the IOC revised its Olympic charter so that today, it used to be like Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the Olympic Games, was proud of what he called his sporting geography or his athletic geography. So before that time, the Olympic Games didn't exactly map what was going on, you know, with nation states. So there were, you know, former colonies, there were territories under the control of a, you know, of a colonial power, just all sorts of entities that weren't actually sovereign states. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, the IOC tightened the rules so that today you pretty much have to be a sovereign state recognized by the United Nations to be accepted, to have a National Olympic Committee accepted. However, some of the entities left over from the messy times were grandfathered in. So, for example, Hong Kong has its own Olympic team because it was grandfathered in. Macau never had an Olympic team. In 1997, Hong Kong returned to China, and China would probably be just as happy if the Hong Kongese had to represent China and didn't have their own team. Macau doesn't have its own team. So if they were to make an Olympic team, it would have to be the Chinese team, which is pretty difficult for them. So you have today you have all of these anomalies. You do have nations that aren't actually sovereign nations, and then combined with something that more closely maps the geopolitical map and the United Nations. So there's that. On the other hand, when you look at the athletes that represent the nations and the coaches that coach the athletes, you find that the lines between nations are incredibly blurry. So citizenship swapping is bigger than it has ever been, and it is now including nations that didn't used to be part of it. I mean, traditionally, athletes in former colonies maybe would represent the metropole. So former African colonies of France would represent France, for example. So that was more the pattern. But now you have things going on that are like all over the map. I mean, something that was really interesting was that Kyle Anderson, an NBA player, was allowed to swap citizenship to become Chinese because he had a grandmother from Jamaica whose father was Jamaican and mother was Chinese. So because of his quote unquote, Chinese heritage, he was invited to represent China with the hopes that it would help China qualify for the Olympic Games, but unfortunately it didn't. But so this is actually new for China. They just started it in the lead up of the 2022 Winter Games because China is rather xenophobic and it has a very restrictive citizenship law. Normally, naturalization is limited to people with a Chinese, ancestor. So even China has been reluctantly drawn into this transnational mess that actually underlies the nationalism we see when teams march into the stadium. I mean, many of the American athletes are foreign born or the children of immigrants. There are many American citizens who are representing other countries. So nationalism these days isn't what it used to be. I would also say, I was an athlete during the Cold War. I competed, I did track and field. I was a heptathlete. I competed against the Soviet Union, for example. And, sometimes people talk about, oh, we're entering a new Cold War. But I would say from the perspective of sports, it's not anything like it was during the Cold War. Because in those days, sport was one of the only places that you could run into a person from the Soviet Union. And when you were at these competitions, they were really tightly controlled by their chaperones, and they were not encouraged to learn English. Some of them did, but if they wanted to speak English with you, they would have to sneakily do it on the field, when the coaches weren't looking. So there was not even like free interchange between athletes during the competition because they were always being watched. For one reason, because it was feared that they would defect. So like the whole, in the Cold War, it was really a divided world, even in the realm of sports. And that is just not the case these days. I mean, in St. Louis, we have a former world champion pair skater, who's now a local ice skating coach here. Just the way that people move back and forth between national borders is it's completely different. I would like to believe that we can't go backwards either. I would like to believe that whatever happens out there, that is not going to change.
Thank you. I'm going to get in one more question, and then if you are listening and you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Dr. Sarah, one interesting bio point that I did not mention is that you spent 10 years working with the Islamic Republic of Iran in building a women's softball program. So I imagine that many people would be surprised to hear this, sort of based on our own stereotypes. And I think Dr. Susan also just referenced this idea of how, where sports can help different cultures and societies meet. So how do you see sports as being a way into societies? And what did you learn from that experience that surprised or challenged you?
Yeah. I think it's funny that you prefaced it with many people might be surprised. Even with our work with the State Department now, and this work in Iran happened a number of years ago between 1999 and 2008. But even now, I meet people in the State Department and they're like, wait, you were where doing what? So yes, it is very surprising. And at the time, 1999, I was probably, I don't know, 26 years old. I didn't know much about the Islamic Republic of Iran. The only understanding I had, it was like these distant memories of a black and white television when I was growing up, watching the hostage crisis, and the iconic images of our Marines with the blindfold and the takeover of our US Embassy in Tehran. So when I received this phone call, and the person who called me introduced herself as the daughter of the reigning president of Iran. At the time, her position was the vice president of the National Olympic Committee. And they were developing and had recently developed, under her leadership, the Islamic Federation of Women's Sports, which was for all female athletes residing in Muslim majority nations. And so they ended up working to create their own, what they called the Islamic Women's Games, or the Muslim Olympics, so that Muslim women could come to Iran and know that they had the utmost adherence to the Islamic dress code and the proper. So I think Iran hosted 3 or 4 iterations of their own Muslim Women's Olympics. And so I had the opportunity to take a Muslim woman American to those games and represent. And you talk about the most amazing opening ceremonies. It was in Tehran, watching all these Muslim women from around the world. And it was interesting because the time that we took the first American woman to compete in those games, it was in October of 2001. So it was on the heels of 9/11 that we went to Tehran to compete in the Islamic Women's Games. And we were seated in between the Afghan delegation and the Iraqi delegation. And we were a delegation of 2. And you can imagine the media frenzy, but the beauty of it was the connection and the ability to interact and to love on and to hug and to celebrate one another's athleticism and the humanity again with the Iraqis and the Afghans was absolutely beautiful. So for 10 years, at least 1 month every year, I was there to help develop just the Islamic women's sports system as a whole, which very much looked like our old AIAW. So before the NCAA, when it was like all women's league, it was all the coaches were women, all the administrators, all the officials, all the everything. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. So anyway, for what it's worth, it was quite telling for me that in the relations between the United States and Iran, somehow women's sports was on the radar to bring us together. So through that time, we developed the first women's Iranian fast pitch softball team. We brought an American team, which was the first American women's team to compete in Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. We also took a women's basketball team. That was the first. There today are still 13 women's softball teams in Iran competing, which is like the most Western American sport. But I would say the evolution of all that really demonstrated to me the power of sport to supersede long-standing, and did it solve all the problems? No. But do I believe that if the women who play softball in Iran and the women who play sports in America could rise to be the leaders, that those countries could, that our two countries could solve some problems? I absolutely do. I say the power of a softball bat can solve a lot of problems.
Speak softly and carry a large bat.
Exactly. We also said we were between Iraq and a hard place. So yes, the softball, yes. And we also say the Iranian women came up with a woman's place is at home plate.
I'd like to turn to the Q&A box now. We have some good questions coming in. I have one here. Dr. Susan, I'll start with you. And it's about the recent doping accusations and how China's anti-doping agency is complaining about double standards applied to Chinese competitors. So given your experience with China, what is your take on this back and forth of the doping accusations? And how does that sort of play into this whole sportsman
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I think China really got criticized, intensely for doping issues, particularly in swimming, starting in the 1990s, and there were some long distance runners. And this was about the time it started bidding for Olympic Games, and so the central leadership recognized that these, really harsh criticisms, accusations of doping were having a negative effect on China's soft power, if we want to return to that theme. So, and played a role in the failure of its first Olympic bid in 1993 for the 2000 Olympic Games, because there had been a big scandal with distance runners and swimmers in the lead up to that. As a result, I had felt over the years that China actually had one of the stricter, anti-doping efforts in the world, because, there was more at stake than just keeping sport clean. There was also the issue of China's pursuit of soft power and its national image. And, surrounding the 2008 Olympic Games, the anti-doping protocols internally were just incredibly strict because they really didn't want to cancel out everything they were trying to do with a whole host of positive tests at their own Olympic Games. So I was a little bit, surprised at what happened. And again, it was in the realm of swimming, which had already been the problem realm before, the problem sport. I will say one small thing in China's defense, which is that this was during the pandemic when China was in complete lockdown. And I myself couldn't even get into China until a couple years later, the number of flights, international flights, was so small. I did have some Chinese visiting scholars in that time, and they couldn't even guarantee they could get into and out of China because, they would think they were on one flight and there was only one a week. And if it were canceled, they didn't know when they'd get on another flight. So that's how bad, the situation was getting into and out of China. So I think that was a real hindrance to WADA, when they got wind of this episode, which, China did confess eventually, to follow up. And when WADA said, was unable to, completely follow up or whatever, I think that was, a real factor. Now, but anyway, it looks like maybe swimming had developed a problem again. And I think probably there will be another crackdown on swimming. But I have just never seen evidence that China has had in the last couple of decades a state-centered, state-sponsored doping system like we know that East Germany had, and like we found out later the Soviet Union had, and that's for the reasons I mentioned, the soft power issue. I could be wrong, but I've never, I've talked to people about it. I've even talked to scholars inside China that were asked themselves to investigate what was going on with the doping. And when it happened, it was often thought to be limited either to a particular province, and even more typically, a particular sport in a particular province, where the problem was not centralized control, the problem was lack of enough central control over what was going on. You know, we'll just have to see how this plays out. It was ugly. It wasn't handled well by WADA, and let's just hope we can move on and get things under control.
Sounds good. We have a bunch of questions that's looking at the IOC's credibility sort of in this larger context of these other systems. And so I'll put this to you, Dr. Sarah, and then Dr. Susan, feel free to chime in. And obviously it's a very broad question, so take it however you want. But the questioner is asking, they're asking about how the IOC can balance its mission with the reality of political and commercial influences on sports, as well as like the actions of countries or individual athletes. So there's a lot in there, whether it's the political systems, commercial influences, and then the actions of individual countries or athletes.
Ooh, that's a loaded question. Dr. Susan, I may have to go to you on that. I don't know that I'm qualified to even take a stab at that. So maybe repeat the question and let Dr. Susan take it, because I think she is the foremost expert in this room about that topic.
All right.
Well, it
Dr.
is
Susan.
something I have done a lot of research on, and also talked internally with the IOC about, you know, because the IOC really endured a big attack in 2008 for even giving the Olympic Games to China in the first place. And as you remarked, human rights became a central issue surrounding those games. Like, how can you give the games to a nation with a questionable human rights effort? So, you know, afterwards, and the IOC recognized that its own reputation had taken a hit because, you know, the IOC has soft power too, and they have to, you know, try to preserve their soft power as well. And so they underwent a lot of, you know, internal discussion, examination, and actually in that time, since 2008, the IOC organizationally and in terms of policy has changed a lot. I think people don't often track, you know, they tend to forget that the IOC is a player in here just like everybody else, and it has its own politics and policies and whatever. So, for example, Paris is the first Olympic Games for which the host city contract involved a human rights clause. And things had happened that weren't even possible in 2008, because after that time, the United Nations developed its guiding principles on human rights in business. So having now United Nations guidelines, which didn't exist, you know, when the contract with China was signed, the IOC can now require a host country to follow the United Nations guidelines. So a whole web of international policy and law surrounding human rights has now been woven, and Paris is the first games in which really it was actually implemented, and we'll just have to see how it plays out going forward. So the IOC, you know, contrary to what most people think, I've heard one journalist ask me, why does the IOC never change? Actually, it's changed a lot because in 2008, I don't think Jacques Raga ever would have written human rights into the contract. He was old-fashioned. He was one of those who believed in let's just let sport be sport, you know, let's bring them together and good will happen. Now the IOC is more pragmatic, and it's, you know, following specific developments in the international, in sort of the world. You know, another history lesson, it is interesting, or I think I should point out that there has been no national boycott since the end of the Cold War. So the problem of nations withdrawing and holding back their athletes was already solved after the Cold War. And the reason for that was that the then president, Juan Antonio Samaranch, went around the world talking to heads of state and convinced everybody that boycotts don't accomplish political goals, and they only harm the athletes. And that is actually really a very strong consensus out there among the heads of state and national Olympic committees. So when all the furor about boycotts these days is not coming from governments, it's actually coming from NGOs. So Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, there are NGOs who will use the Olympic Games as a platform to attract attention to their specific agendas, which I think in a way it's a little hypocritical to call for a boycott because it's that platform that brings attention to your cause in the first place, which, Sarah, by the way, I think that's a pragmatic thing about Olympic politics that we all ought to appreciate, that not only do they bring athletes together peacefully, but they also create a huge media platform, for people who want to draw attention to global issues.
Yes, absolutely.
So anyway, I think I'll stop there. You asked about, the agendas of individual countries, but actually individual countries are generally on board with understanding the importance of being present at the Olympic Games. And that's kind of what has allowed now, for the first time ever, the banning of Russian athletes, because it wouldn't matter if Russia didn't want to be there, but now countries really want to be there, so you can punish them by not allowing them to attend.
That's a great point.
Sorry, which is interesting because I think about the case of Afghanistan now, right? And they send a few women athletes, but none of them can train in Afghanistan. They all have to be outside. The policies within is girls are not able to go to school beyond the 3rd or 6th grade. All women are banned from any sport. So Afghanistan's participation is quite complicated. We helped 29 women's basketball players who were targeted when the Taliban took over in August of 21, as did many athletes, female athletes, have to escape the country. So we've worked to help legally resettle 13 women's basketball players here in Knoxville, Tennessee, because of the legacy of Pat Summitt and her commitment to empowering girls and women through the power of education and the power of basketball. And we thought if anyone should stand up for the human rights of these Afghan women's basketball players who are being persecuted only because they want an education, only because they want to play basketball, and only because they're women, in the global scheme of things, who should stand up for their human rights? It wasn't FIBA, it wasn't the IOC, it wasn't FIBA, USA Basketball. There were no national entities. And this is the case for all displaced persons that are athletes, is that there's no organizing body that is standing up for the human rights abuses of displaced athletes, which is another topic that is massive. And so it's individuals doing that. They got to, the women's football team got to Australia, not because, and FIFA actually was quite helpful, but not the driving force. And so there's a huge issue, which could be a whole other webinar, Courtney, around athletes that are displaced and who is responsible for them, because they're local federations, the IFs. Most entities, governing bodies say, well, we're not in the business of refugees and displaced persons. So who is responsible for them after they've been representing their country in their national program? So that was just
Thank you. Oh, that's fascinating. And kind of as almost a follow-on to that, I mean, you referenced the Taliban, I think, as an extreme case in terms of what happens when certain values collide with women in sports. But we even referenced, in the United States, I think, so much just happened almost very recently. And so how have you experienced in promoting women's sports that, where that line is in terms of promoting women in sports? And, are you seeing pushback from society or different channels in societies? And how have you dealt with that?
Sure. Well, it varies across the board. I will say what's been helpful is that, and to your point, Dr. Susan, the IOC making changes, it's just been recently that the IOC is willing to say, for example, we'll take the Kingdom of Saudi. where ahead of the London Olympic Games, the IOC was putting pressure on the Saudi National Olympic Committee to say, if you don't send a female athlete, then your men are not, they're not eligible to compete. Like, there has to be gender representation, and NOCs, National Olympic Committees, have to take gender representation seriously. And so I actually had the privilege of being in Riyadh and a part of some of those meetings leading up to the London Games, and negotiating and working with the Saudi NOC about female representation. And the ironic thing, and this may be just a bonus round, I was in a car with male colleagues, and we drove up to the NOC in Riyadh, and at the guard shack, and the guards came out and they looked in the car and they saw a female. And of course I was covered respectfully. And they said, she can't, everyone can come inside, but she cannot come. And so through our host said, well, she's the one that's having the meeting. It's like, it is about this topic. And they said, we're sorry, like, there are no women allowed on this property. It was the campus for the NOC. And so there was a whole bunch of commotion. And so then they called inside, and inside the people that we were meeting with said, yes, indeed. So anyway, all that to say, there was a heavy escort and a big deal just to get me into the building. When I was in the building, we had a 4-hour meeting. Eventually, Saudi sent an equestrian athlete. She was living outside the country, again, not training inside, but they met the quota of having representation, and everybody was allowed to compete. And a lot of things have happened since then. Saudi now, as a result of that, has implemented physical education curriculum across the nation that now includes girls beyond the age of 9, that they value physical education beyond the age of 9, all the way throughout their academic career, or through high school. But during a 4-hour meeting, I'm just going to be really vulnerable, I had to use the restroom. I had water in the morning and I worked out and I needed to use the restroom. So I politely asked during one of our breaks, tea breaks, if I could use the restroom. You should have seen the shock on their face. So think, if a woman is not allowed on the property, do you think they had a women's restroom? No. And they were mortified because they didn't know what to do with me. They didn't know, so there was a big long, and then eventually they found one of the servant quarter restrooms far away that wouldn't, be defiled. Anyway, that's just really raw and true. So, but I see that when the IOC and the IPC and FIFA and FIBA and all of these governing bodies commit to gender representation, percentages, gender equity, if you will, it is putting pressure at the national and the local level to raise the level. So this is the Olympics, the first time that we've seen equal representation between male and female athletes, which is huge. The next step then is to get more women coaches, officials, decision makers, administration, and to continue to invest in their professional growth so that there's more women at the table making these decisions and playing a role in these important parts of what I think makes sport so great, which is the diversity that athletes bring and that sport brings to the world in a way that's really fair.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, it was
Really appreciate it. We're now at time, so I'm not going to get to ask my question about what your favorite Olympic sport is, but we'll have to save that for next time. Thank you both so much for this enlightening conversation. Thank you everyone for watching. Our next event, we have one next Wednesday, the 14th, and we'll be talking about talking with the Taliban. So there we go. We do try to keep these briefings free and open to everyone around the world. So if you can, we encourage everyone to donate to keep these alive. So thank you, Dr. Susan. Thank you, Dr. Sarah. Really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the Olympics.
Thank you. Lots of high fives.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.